In this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about, is it time for Evgeni Malkin to come to the Washington Capitals? Nick Backstrom has that hip injury and will miss a good chunk of next season, so that leaves an open spot at center. I think it's time for Evgeni Malkin to come to the Washington Capitals, not to help the Capitals win games, but to help Alex Ovechkin achieve his goal as being the greatest goal scorer of all time. We'll talk about all of that and more next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
You're Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms, and I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check that out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in this edition, this is a special crossover edition as I am joined by Locked On Penguins host Hunter Hodes as we talk about the Washington Capitals, Evgeni Malkin coming to the Washington Capitals. What's the future of Letang in Pittsburgh? And what's the netminding situation for both teams? We'll talk about that next. In this edition of Locked On Capitals and Locked On Penguins, I am joined by Hunter Hodes of Locked On Penguins as we talk about a little Capitals and Penguins. Hunter, welcome to the program.
Yes, thank you for having me on. I haven't done a crossover with Locked On Capitals in a long time, and thank you for coming on my show as well.
You bet. Just to start off the show here, I think that a really great idea, we're headed up on the free agency deadline, is that if Evgeni Malkin would come to the Washington Capitals, I think that we need to put aside any rivalry from the years past. I know we've dealt with that for years, bitter rivals, but I think that Evgeni Malkin should come to the Washington Capitals to assist Alex Ovechkin in his goal chase. What are your thoughts on that?
It makes sense, doesn't it? I think the two are pretty good friends still. Though, the biggest wonder back of my mind is, would Malkin agree to go there? Marc-Andre Fleury, the Capitals were interested in him, I think, multiple times this year. He said, you know what? I'm not going to go there because he's still too much of a Penguin, I think was the reasoning. And, I wonder if, Malkin would feel the same way, or would he feel insulted by the Penguins not, offering him a contract? And, would he go, I guess, full Jaromir Jagr and, sign with one of the Penguins' biggest rivals like he did back in 2012 when he went to Philadelphia? Obviously I wouldn't like it because I don't want to watch him in a Capitals uniform. That just feels gross after everything him and Sid have done for the last 16 years together. Would be cool on a league-wide basis just because, seeing Ovechkin try to break the goal record with another one of the best Russian players to ever play the game. That's good for the league. But, in terms of me, I'm not here for it, but it also makes sense because, I think it sounds like Nicholas Backstrom is probably not coming back at this point. He might, but I think I've done research on that surgery, and I think Ryan Kessler only played 50 games after coming back before he retired. So it also makes a lot of sense if you want to go out and get a second line center for the next few years, if you want to keep contending for the cup. So that's definitely gone through my mind as well.
Yeah, because, like you were talking about there, Nick Backstrom had that hip resurfacing procedure done, and the outlook for him is not too great on that. Generally, players that come back, they only play for a limited period of time. So obviously, Evgeni Malkin would be a good fit there as a first-line center. You guys have had him since 06, 07. I think it's time to share a little bit. And
Brian McClellan loves his former Penguins. Connor Sherry's there. Justin Schultz, Brooks Orpik those years ago, and Carl Hagelin. Anytime he can find one of those Penguin players that have won cups with them, any of the three, he'll scoop them up. So this would not surprise me.
So, just taking a look at his stats, In his career, he has scored 444 goals in 981 games played. So on paper, that seems like a really good option there. So just talking about the Malkin situation, it is a bit of a fluid situation. Gino has said that he will take a pay cut to stay on the Pittsburgh Penguins. But ultimately, at the end of the day, do you think that he will take that pay cut? Because what I'm going to talk to later in the show is about Letang, which is an interesting situation. Do you think that Malkin will take that pay cut to stay on the Pittsburgh Penguins?
I think he can. It's just a matter of how much are the Penguins willing to pay him. Right now, I think that negotiation, from what I've read from Elliot Friedman and a couple other people that cover the team, are more connected than I am. It sounds like that negotiation is not close. And I think part of that is due to them focusing on Chris Letang more. And, with all due respect to Gino, I love the guy to death. But, at the end of the day, Chris Letang, he means, I shouldn't say more to this team, but he's the better player at his position right now than Malkin is. And outside of, him, the defenseman Malkin is not that good. So they're right to focus on him. But, I think that I've been saying on my show for a while, for Malkin, 3 years, 7.1 for his number, like Sid does for 8.7, 7.5 is probably the highest I would go. If he can take a $2 million pay cut, that would be fine. But I'm wondering if Ron Hextall is offering him somewhere in the sixes, and he might be like, hey, I'm not worth that at this point. I know I've had a lot of injuries that I've dealt with over my career, but, I think he still would feel a little slighted in that situation. So this negotiation, I think, is going to go down to the wire. Right now, I'm expecting Letang to come back. It's all a matter of, can they bridge that small gap? And once that potentially happens, they'll shift their focus to Malkin. At least that's kind of what Brian Burke was alluding to this morning yesterday when he talked on Sportsnet. So it's really all a matter of, can the two sides get there for a pay cut that works? The term is fine. They want Sid and Gino to go out together, but it's all a matter of, can you get the money right, and can you not cheap out on one of the 5 greatest players to ever play for this franchise?
Yeah, and one of the issues with Malkin is that he's a bit injury prone. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the show, that the Capitals and the Penguins are kind of going through the same thing, is that, this league is getting younger and faster, and the Penguins and the Bruins and the Capitals are all getting older and older. And part of me thinks, they want to hang on to this nucleus that got them to a Stanley Cup, or, the Penguins multiple Stanley Cups, and the Capitals in 2018. Part of it is I think that the Penguins and the Capitals, they have to get over that a little bit, that, these players are getting older. You take a look at Backstrom, for example, and you take a look at Malkin, who is injured often, is that to a certain extent, I think that, you just got to kind of put away those nostalgic feelings that you have for these certain players and get younger. Because if you take a look at the teams around the league that are doing really well, they are the teams that are getting younger and faster. So just later in the segment, we're talking about the rivalry between these two teams. Of course, it is one of the biggest rivalries in NHL history, I would say. This rivalry stems from the 11 playoff series the two teams have met in, which in the second most between NHL expansion teams between the Dallas Stars and St. Louis Blues. The rivalry reached new heights in the 2010s as the teams won 3 consecutive Stanley Cups between them. In 16 and 17, the Penguins defeated the President Trophy Capitals en route to the championship, while the 2018 Capitals eliminated the 2-time defending championship. So there is a lot of rivalry between these two teams. Of course, there's Alex Ovechkin and Sidney Crosby, who were drafted around the same time, a couple of years apart there. Just talk to me a little bit about that rivalry. What does that mean to you for the Penguins? I know that I'm up for it every time I hear the Capitals and the Penguins are playing together. It's going to be a physical game. Tell me a little bit about what your take is on the Capitals-Penguins rivalry.
For a while, I thought it was, the big brother, little brother aspect, right? The Penguins would always just, whatever the Capitals would do, the Penguins would just come out on top. It almost felt like they had that mental edge or something. And then 2018 came around, the Capitals, they found another gear. I know the Penguins were maybe a little bit gassed from 2 prior Stanley Cup runs, but, they found their gear and they were able to get that championship that year. But, this rivalry's been so much fun over the years. You had the dueling hat trick game is probably one of the greatest games I've ever watched in my life. They had those two pitted against each other from day one. The Russian beast versus the Canadian homeborn that everyone loves to love, and they played so many great games against each other. Another one I'll obviously always love forever was Game 3, 2009, when the Penguins were down 0-2, and that was when Chris Letang really came into his own, I think, and showed a lot of fans that he's the next franchise defenseman, was that overtime winner that probably was one of their top 3 biggest goals of that Stanley Cup run. And I know some players have come and go, new players have come in and all that stuff, but the rivalry has never really changed. I think it's only gotten stronger as the years have gone by. The fan bases absolutely can't stand each other. I mean, I lived in DC for most of my life. I'm down in Richmond right now. It's nasty. I've been to games at Capital One Arena. I've heard what the fan bases have said to each other. I've kept my mouth shut because I don't know why people have to talk a bunch of crap at other arenas, but it's nasty. It's a ferocious rivalry. I think right now it's probably the Penguins' biggest rivalry. The Pens Flyers has not been the same the last few years. I think it's partly due to the Flyers just not being as good and the Penguins just beating up on them most of the times. But it's crazy, Dan, that both of these teams have just they've gone on at like the same trajectory. Right now they've won their championships. Their cores are a bit older, and they face some pretty interesting decisions this summer. Both of them are almost in the same spot, basically. So it's been an awesome rivalry, to say the least.
Yeah, and just giving kind of credit where credit's due, of course. I'm a fan of the Washington Capitals, as it's apparent here. But just giving credit where credit's due, all-time series 159, 127 Pittsburgh, regular season 119-99 Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh leads in most of all the categories against the Capitals in the postseason. The largest victory was 12-1. So just taking a look back on that, there is that bitter rivalry that goes back and forth. But just looking at statistically speaking, the Pittsburgh Penguins have the upper hand. All right, so after the break here, Hunter is going to have his questions for me on the Washington Capitals. But first, betonline.net is the #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts.
All right, so we are back here on this special crossover episode of Locked On Penguins and Locked On Capitals. I'm Hunter Hodes. Dan Holme is over there. So, Dan, again, I'll bring this up. Very same things with the Penguins and the Capitals here. 4 straight first-round exits for these teams. The Capitals lost in 6 hard-fought games, I should say, to the Florida Panthers. In my opinion, I think they gave the blueprint to the Lightning on how to beat the Panthers in that series. The Capitals, they were 100 seconds away from going up 3-1 in that series. Had they won that game, I think they would have won the series. I think Florida would have just been broken at that point. But there's a lot of interesting things that can happen this summer. It sounds like, at least, obviously the surgery with Backstrom. Even as a rival fan, no one should have to have their career potentially ended like that, especially someone that's a legend. And Washington is probably one of the 5 greatest players to ever play for that franchise. I think you're free. I think you have Carl Hagelin as a potential free agent. Justin Schultz is a free agent, former Penguin, of course. I've seen rumors that Lars Eller could be on the trade block. I've seen some of the fans that I talked to from back home who really follow the team have been wondering if, John Carlson's going to be on the team next year with that contract. What do you see the Capitals doing this summer, and does it involve potentially getting a new starting goaltender?
Absolutely. So that is the one thing that the Capitals need to concentrate on. I think that ultimately Vitek Vanacek or Ilya Samsonov will be the number 2, and then the Capitals will have to go and check the free agent market or trade to get that big name number 1 netminder. Just because the netminding was the big deficiency this entire season. We kind of knew the issues all season, and Brian McClellan, the GM, was all in on it, and we saw what kind of results we had. Another first-round exit. But my detractors would also say that tandem also got them to 100 points. So, and if it was in any other division, maybe they would have been in a better position. 100 points isn't ultimately too bad. But consistency was the issue with Vanacek and Samsonov. So that is what they need. They ultimately need that number 1 netminder. I get asked quite often who I think they'll go with as the number 2. I think it'll be Ilya Samsonov. He was drafted higher. He has a higher ceiling. He's the better athlete. And I think that that's ultimately what they'll do. But I think that, kind of a lot like the Penguins, the Capitals need to get younger. You talked about Lars Eller. They don't have, the defense core. They need to address that as well. Just because if you take a look at it, like I said, this is a league that's getting younger and faster. And I think that they need to then address the defense, of course, because every time I bring up and I say, the goaltending was the reason the Capitals weren't good this season, people say, no, it was the defense, Dan. So let's both agree and say that we need to, adjust the defense and the goaltending. But I think that big changes are coming. You brought up Lars Eller and perhaps John Carlson. And of course, if you're going to get that big name player, you're going to have to give up someone big. You're not going to get that big name player for a fourth line, essentially AHL player. So you're going to have to give up someone big, like maybe a John Carlson or maybe a TJ Oshie. And when I bring that up, people are like, TJ Oshie, John Carlson, are you crazy? Yeah, we got to kind of move on from this nucleus. I understand that people have these nostalgic feelings. This is the team that got into the 2018 Cup, but we got to move forward. If you want to take a look at a team that did it the right way, take a look at the Rangers. They were kind of horrible there for about a year and a half. But now look at them. They did, they made it to the playoffs. They didn't win a cup, but they looked at what they had on the ice about a year and a half ago, and they said, this isn't working. So it was just like a fire sale. They got rid of all the players on their team. Like I say, they had about that year and a half that they were poor. But then, they turned it around. So I think that if the Capitals could use a blueprint, something similar to what the New York Rangers had, I think that the future is bright. It's, might be ugly for, maybe a season or two, but that's ultimately what they have to do to get younger.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a really interesting offseason for them. I look at their cap friendly at times, and there's a lot of long-term deals there. I remember, a lot of people thought TJ Oshie was going to go to market. He signed that massive extension. It's aged like a fine wine for almost that first half so far. I think it's that back half that could potentially get bad if his production does go down. I think there were a lot of rumors last year, Dan, that Evgeni Kuznetsov was going to be on the block, but I would say that's probably not going to happen now, considering he had a really good bounce back year, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. He had that off season where he had issues with COVID for one, and then he had some personal issues I don't really want to get into, but he has worked through those. And he is a more mature player. Definitely. He was number 2 on the Capitals in goals this season. Ovechkin was number 1, Kuznetsov number 2, and Wilson number 3. So yeah, he has definitely turned the corner there. And I definitely would say, he plays on the top line. He is the number 1 center for the Washington Capitals. And I'm glad he was able to figure it out, because to your point, a lot of the beat writers around the Capitals area, that season that he was poor, they said they would get rid of him or trade him, but no one wants him, or, they're not going to give up enough capital to necessitate that trade. So in any case, he was able to turn it around. And I think that, Kuznetsov is swinging upwards and has a good trajectory going forward. And I'm glad they did stick with him, especially since Nick Backstrom will most likely be out a good chunk of next season.
Yeah. I think had they had traded him last offseason or something like that, this would have been, I think, a lot more of a mess. So, I do agree. I think the Penguins also need to get younger and faster to surround the core if they are brought back, just like the Capitals. Do you have a few players in mind that you would like to see them go after in free agency or the trade market even, because that's going to heat up here within the next week or so, especially with the draft coming up?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the big names out there, of course, and I think that, you hear the JT Miller, you hear Nazem Kadri, you hear Johnny Gaudreau. I think any of those guys would ultimately be a good fit for the Washington Capitals. And then I'll put a podcast out and they'll say, well, they'll never come to the Capitals. And I say, hey, the Washington Capitals have a pedigree of winning. They won a cup in 2018, and it's not like I'm talking about the Phoenix Coyotes, no offense, or the Arizona Coyotes rather. So I think that, they need to go out there and they need to get those big name players. But, I don't ever want to get a player if they have to, part with a draft pick or something like that. Because a lot of times when you go after these big name players, they want something big in return. And usually that's a top prospect and a draft pick and that kind of thing. And I think that that's what has got the Capitals, and I think to the Penguins to a certain extent, into the position they are, is that constantly being in win now mode. Win now mode comes at a price. And that also means depleting your AHL and ECHL affiliate. And I'm all about getting a Nazem Kadri or some of these big names, as long as we don't have to give up a big name at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they'll have the cap space to do it more than the Penguins, I think, will have at that time. You can stick Backstrom on LTIR. That's what I believe $9.2 million right there. Right. I mean, and we talked about Evgeni Malkin in the first segment. There's your money to give him if you want to really give him that contract, or the total chaos option if he goes to market. Dan, bringing back Philip Forsberg after all those years with that hilarious trade that will live in just a big memory of.
In my opinion, the worst trade in Capitals history. I mean, like I talked about in my podcast, I remember being at work, Twitter went off and they said that the Capitals traded Philip Forsberg for Martin Erat and Michael Latta. Martin Erat scored 2 goals for the Washington Capitals. And if you want to take a look at the stat sheet for Philip Forsberg, it's quite impressive. The diamond in the rough in that situation was Michael Latta, who brought some of the intangibles. He was that kind of rough, tough guy, the sandpaper personality. But in any case, a really horrible trade in the history books for the Washington Capitals.
Yeah, I remember getting that alert. I think I was in school at the time. I think I was like a sophomore or something like that, and I just looked at it, I was like, wow, they really decided to make that decision. But lastly though, Dan, want to get your thoughts on this is, I think, a topic that some of my friends have been discussing, and a couple other Capitals fans I know. Peter Laviolette just completed another season as the Washington Capitals head coach, a couple first round exits in a row. Do you see him being on the hot seat at all next year, or do you see him being the coach for the next several seasons?
So it's interesting you bring that up. GM Brian McClellan, when he was asked about Peter Laviolette's job, he said, "I'll keep that between us." So, it's kind of an interesting thing to say, if you were, for sure about your head coach, don't you think you would tell everyone in the media that, his job is safe? So to give that answer that, I'm going to keep that between us staff was a bit of an interesting thing to say. I mean, I think that ultimately Brian McClellan's job might be at risk at some point, especially if they make another first round exit next year. I take a look at the goaltending situation. He knew that was a problem all season, and he didn't do anything about it. I talked to JJ Regan from NBC Sports Washington, and one of the things he told me is you think they would have picked up any netminder and hoped they would have caught fire. So I think that there's going to be a hot seat for Laviolette and McClellan if they face another first round exit next year, or say they don't even make it to the playoffs.
Yeah, that was also going to be probably my last one. Do you foresee the Capitals as a playoff team next year? I think your answer would be yes, considering how this year played out with how all the 8 teams were just well above all the other teams in the Eastern Conference. But right now, do you see them as a playoff team again next year?
I do, but the first thing that they need to address is that netminding situation. Like I said on my podcast, if we go into next season and it's Vanacek and Samsonov as the tandem, feel free to bang your head against the wall, because I think we know where that's going to go. It's going to be rough, and we can talk about depth and netminding, and I'll ask you a little bit about that in the final segment here. I don't think Louis Domingue being the start or the goalie in the playoffs was in the script, but yeah, I ultimately think that the Capitals will make it to the playoffs. I think they can make a big push if they pick up a big netminder and shore up the defense and maybe some depth forwards as well.
Yeah. So coming up in the final segment, we are going to get into Dan asking me questions about the Penguins this offseason, because this is probably the Penguins' biggest offseason in probably 2 decades. I would say at this point, this is a very pivotal moment, I would say, in the franchise history. But Before we get to that, from the people who invented healthy and tasty comes the latest gift to your taste buds. You've probably tried the amazing coconut brownie chunk Built bar, but guess what? Your friends at Built have given coconut brownie chunk the Puffs treatment. That's right, the coconut brownie chunk Built bar flavor you love in a deliciously chewy marshmallow covered in 100% real chocolate. It's like a fluffy cloud of coconut brownie goodness. But stop drooling and listen. They are good for you. They're low calorie, low sugar, high protein, and all of them are delicious. All Built bars are made with protein, which your body absorbs more efficiently and provides a ton of health benefits. You can eat something that tastes good and is good for you. The best part about them, of course, is that they taste amazing, but you can enjoy them guilt-free because they are actually good for you. They are the perfect treat. Perfect when you got a craving, you need to satisfy your sweet tooth, or if you need a quick, healthy snack, they're an excellent source of protein. You go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15, and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com.
All right, in this final segment here, I'm going to talk to Hunter about my questions for the Pittsburgh Penguins. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find Hunter Hodes on Twitter. It's at Hunter Hodes. So in this final segment here, let's talk a little Penguins. And the big question for the Pittsburgh Penguins is Letang. Who replaces Letang on the blue line if he does move on or he leaves the team? 68 points in 78 games. He's only 35 years old. He was getting 26 to 27 minutes a night. Highest career point season. The asking on him is 7.25 for 3 years. Talk to us a little bit about Chris Letang. When I listen to the NHL Network and I listen to all the big talking heads on the NHL, they say that the Letang guy, he is the one that the Pittsburgh Penguins need to lock up. It would be nice to get Malkin and Letang, but if you have to pick the one, ultimately it has to be Letang. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're making me choose between the two, which I would hate to do, it would probably be Letang. He is the priority right now. I said it to open the show. Brian Burke spoke yesterday and said, they're having, I think more discussions right now with his agent than Malkin's. Elliot Friedman was on the Vets Hockey Talk podcast and said when he reported, it was a couple weeks ago when he reported that they were about 1.2 million apart. He believes that's shrunk a little bit more. So it's all about them coming to the right cap hit. But in terms of who replaces him, Dan, I mean, that's a great question. There's so many fans in this Penguins fan base that, come in my mentions or I hear it on Sports Talk Radio. Well, you got to get rid of him. He's a turnover machine, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, who is replacing that production that he had this last year? Crickets. People are going to try to tell me John Klingberg. Okay, go look at what John Klingberg did in Dallas this year. I get he had Rick Bowness as his head coach, who was a very defensive-oriented coach. But at the end of the day, he was in the second percentile for even strength defense. 98% of his peers are better defensively, and people want to get rid of Letang because he sometimes commits a few turnovers. It's just very weird to me. You would probably have to trade for someone to replace Chris Letang. Jacob Chikrin's on the market. You probably don't have the assets to get him. It doesn't hurt to ask. Matt Dumba is probably on the market. You may not have the assets to get him. It also doesn't hurt to ask. Klingberg, he's going to probably want 7x7, 8x8, something like that on the open market. I would much rather give Letang, I've been saying this on my show for a while, 4x8, 5x8, something like that. And I understand that players definitely, they get worse as they get older. Father time is always undefeated. But, does anything really matter outside of after the next 3 years when Sidney Crosby's contract is up? I personally don't think so. So if he still has 2 years left on that contract, so what? Maybe if the team is not that good, you can flip him to a contender and get a decent return back. But at the very least, he is the best player at, his position on the free agent market right now. You need to be doing everything in your power to keep him based on the momentum that I've been reading and all this stuff. Going into this offseason, I thought it would be Malkin that would be signed in. Letang, maybe not, but I flipped that now. I think Letang does get done. The bigger question is what happens with Malkin.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, but I think that Letang would be kind of hard to replace, to your point. So let's take a look at the netminding situation for the Penguins as well. Like I talked about, oftentimes we hear about the number one netminder and the number two. Well, for the Pittsburgh Penguins, it was about the number 3 netminder, and I think that having Domingue start in the playoffs was not really according to script. Where are the Penguins at, according to that? The DeSmith injury that I've read online was kind of more of a core muscle injury. What is the status of DeSmith, and what do you think that the goalie tandem is going to be for the Pittsburgh Penguins come the fall?
I mean, that's a great question. So I definitely think Tristan is going to be the starter. The Penguins believe in him. If it wasn't for a freak injury that happened from Anders Lee, I do think the Penguins win that series against the Rangers. Sure, it's a what if right now, but they were playing well enough under Louis freaking Domingue that I feel like if they had their starter in net, they would have won that 4th game in 5 or 6 games. I don't even think it would have went 7. Backup wise, that's where it gets interesting. Josh Yohe of The Athletic today said that he doesn't think DeSmith is coming back. But then I read from David Pagnon of the Fourth Period that the Penguins and DeSmith are in some negotiations to potentially come back on a cheap deal. So I really have no clue what's going on with that. In my humble opinion, I would move on from him and sign a veteran backup in free agency. An option that, may haunt some Capitals fans here. Braden Holtby out of the Dallas Stars. His contract is up. They just signed Scott Wedgwood today to a cheap 2-year deal. He's going to go to market. He's not going to go back there. So on a cheap 1 or 2 year deal to be a stopgap option for Jari, that makes a lot of sense for me. Tristan played too much in the first half of the regular season last year. He was obviously gassed by the end of the season. I'm not going to really blame him getting hurt on that, but he was definitely hurt. I just messed up my words. He was definitely feeling it towards the end of the season because DeSmith was struggling in the first half. And, sure, he found his game a little bit in the second half, but, it was kind of a little too late, I should say. Then he played the rest of the season with that awful injury where he just couldn't go anymore in the playoffs. And that's also 2 years in a row where DeSmith has gotten hurt right when the playoffs start. So I wouldn't bring back the same tandem 3 times in a row. I would go out and get a veteran backup. And as for Louis Domingue, great story with all that stuff, but he let in some goals during the playoffs that I would like to think a 3rd string goalie at least could still save.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting story. I heard him. He was actually on Steve Koulias's show on the Power Play on NHL Radio. It was interesting. He was like, I was eating spicy chicken and broccoli before the game. I wasn't even expecting that I was going to go in the game. But, all things considered, I think, given the situation he was in, he did a pretty good job. Now, I got to ask you about one goalie that should be pretty familiar to you, Marc-Andre Fleury. Is it time to bring him back to the Pittsburgh Penguins? He's kind of at the end of his career, I would say. I think that's not a bad idea for the Penguins as well. I think that Penguins' blood runs deep, and I think that he would like to maybe finish his career in the Steel City. What are your thoughts on that?
I think he definitely would, but my biggest thing is how much is he going to cost? The pressure on Tristan if Fleury comes back is going to be through the roof. You have a franchise icon behind you who, let's face it, Dan, fans would want to see him start most of the games.
Sure.
Tristan, for as good as he played last year, and he was a top 10 goaltender in the league, in my opinion. I don't know if he's going to play at that level if he has a franchise icon right behind him. Sure, he could probably pitch in 30, 35 games, probably more than that. Maybe it's an even split. But the money would have to make sense. If it's, $3 million, I would kind of say 2.5. And I'm not trying to sound disrespectful to Fleury because he's coming off a massive contract. But at this point, he's not worth anything near that anymore. It would have to be, I think, a very team-friendly deal for the Penguins to bring him back. And also, Ron Hextall and Brian Burke and the new ownership, they really have no loyalty to him. It's mainly just a few of the core players in that locker room that do. So right now, I can't see it. Would it not surprise me? Yes. But I think there's a couple better options out there than Fleury. There's the potential that he goes back to Minnesota, which, I would be in favor of. I think he did a solid job there. And I think, he has a good relationship with Billy Guerin.
It was an interesting move there. They went all in and swung for the fences and got Marc-Andre Fleury in Minnesota. And then they had Cam Talbot start, which was always a bit of a head scratcher to me on that one. So it remains to be seen. It seems like the goaltending situation between both teams is what's going to kind of really bring into focus how they will do. So Hunter, thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals. We'll have to talk again sometime, maybe during the season, maybe a series or a season preview, something like that. But thank you for joining me on this edition here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Dan. I really appreciate it. And thank you for coming on my show as well. We'll definitely have to do a few crossovers during next season because I'm sure those games are going to be wild, especially if, some interesting things happen for both teams during the offseason.
For sure. All right. Once again, thank you for joining me on this special crossover edition of Locked On Capitals and Locked On Penguins. We'll talk to you again next time.